welcome to another episode of the Symphonic podcast. My name is Bernardo Miethe, and with me, as always, is...
A guy by the name of Andrew Owen.
Yes, a guy by the name of Andrew Owen. All right.
It's officially my name from now on.
Yep. So today we're going to be talking about Herbert Howells and his composition Hymnus Paradisi. And this is a composer that I had never really studied that much. I mean, I heard about him and I might have heard a couple of his choir pieces, but I didn't actually ever study him that much. So it's really cool to learn about him and also hearing this piece. This is a really wonderful work. All right.
Yeah, he's kind of obscure outside of the singing world, despite the fact that he did write some instrumental works.
Yeah.
I do know that my pianist friends know him for his piano concertos, which are fun, delightful 20th century piano pieces that sound nothing like his choral music.
Yeah,
his vocal music, for that matter.
Yeah, and we are going to talk about another English composer today. So last week we did Howells. Today we're going to do another English composer from around the same time. But also,
That's right.
There's a new thing that we're introducing today. Up until today, we've been talking about orchestral pieces that are only with only orchestras. Today we're actually going to talk about a piece that's for orchestra, of course, but also for choir. So that's a new thing for today.
Yeah, I mean, Mahler tried it a couple times, adding choirs to his pieces, but
Oh, yeah.
Howells did it quite exclusively.
Oh yeah, but we're actually going to talk about a piece with choir.
This is our first go.
So tell me about it, about Howells.
Well, Herbert Howells, was born in Lydney, Gloucestershire. He was the youngest of 6 children, of Oliver Howells, a plumber, painter, decorator, and builder, sort of a handyman, and his wife Elizabeth. His father was a musician. He played the organ at the local Baptist church, and Herbert himself showed early musical promise. I imagine having something to do with how much time he heard music all around his growing up. He was born in 1892, if that wasn't clear. 1892. He dies in 1983, so he pretty much spans the 20th century in his adult life, well until 1983. In any case, so yeah, his father played the organ at the local Baptist church. Herbert himself had plenty of musical promise. He occasionally subbed for his father at that church, and then moving at the age of 11 to the local Church of England parish church as a choir boy and an unofficial deputy organist. So he was a person who very quickly, as a child, started getting comfortable with music and making music with other people.
Yeah. So the Howells family, the Howells family's financial position was always precarious, and at some point in Howells' adolescence, his father became bankrupt, which was very humiliating for them in this small community that they lived in. And also, this was a financial crisis that Howells never actually fully recovered from. Financially assisted by a member of the family of Charles Bathurst, which was the first Viscount of Bledisloe.
You really have to appreciate the Brits for their outrageous names.
Yes.
Bathurst, first Viscount Bledisloe.
Bledisloe.
I guess that's probably how you pronounce it. I don't know.
That sounds perfect. And this Viscount, he had taken an interest in the musician in Howells. So Howells began music lessons in 1905 with Herbert Brewer, which was the organist of the Gloucester Cathedral, and at 16 he became his student at the cathedral alongside Ivor Novello and Ivor Gurney. The later, Ivor Gurney became a close friend of Howells, and the pair they would go on long walks through the Gloucester.
You gotta love English.
Gloucestershire.
And Gloucestershire.
Gloucestershire. There's too much in there. So they would walk.
There are a few silent bits.
They would walk along through the Gloucestershire countryside, discussing their shared love of music and English literature.
Yeah, so that's one thing about the English lifestyle, especially around the early 20th century, is that you could literally walk anywhere and just go along the countryside, and it was really quite pleasant. You weren't necessarily trespassing. It all belongs to the king.
Yeah, I mean, Howells did it too, so here's another.
Oh, yeah, it's just pleasant to go on walks. It's harder in the United States to go on nice long walks, unless you happen to own several acres of forested land.
Yeah, you might get shot.
Yeah, people get uppity about that kind of stuff. So another formative experience for the young Howells was the premiere in September 1910 of Ralph Vaughan Williams's Fantasia on the theme of Thomas Tallis. This premiere occurred over at the Gloucester Three Choirs Festival, a really well-known and really big choral festival that happened quite frequently. So Howells liked to relate in after years how Vaughan Williams sat next to him for the remainder of this concert and shared his score of Elgar's The Dream of Gerontius with the awestruck aspiring composer. He was sort of sat on the lap of Vaughan Williams as a youngin, as well, relatively young. He was still a teenager. Both Vaughan Williams and the Tudor composers, of which Tallis was one profoundly, influenced Howells' later work. So he was a person who I think was trying to embody some British English musical tradition. I'm not entirely sure if you can consider him someone who is terribly nationalistic.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think he probably was. I mean, but I think he was a little more universalistic in his approach to things, which we'll talk about later with Take Him Worth for Cherishing, a work dedicated to Kennedy's assassination, to his death.
Yeah. So in 1912, following the example of Ivor Gurney, his friend, Howells moved to London to study at the Royal College of Music, and here his teachers included Stanford, Hubert Parry, and Charles Wood. Among Howells' contemporaries in the student body were Gurney, Arthur Bliss, and Arthur Benjamin. Okay.
So if you needed to be a composer in England, and you needed to take from these people, these are, Charles Wood, Stanford, Parry, we all, people who sing in choir still sing all of these people's music on a regular basis. These are really prominent folks.
Yeah. So Howells blossomed in what he considered the cozy family atmosphere at the college. And his Mass in the Dorian mode was performed at Westminster Cathedral under R. Terry within weeks of his arrival. For the most part, however, his music at this time was orchestral, works included a piano concerto, withdrawn after its first performance, also a light orchestral suite, the Bees portraying his friends at the college, and the three dances for violin and orchestra. More typical of the works with which Howells was later to be associated were his earliest important compositions for organ, the first set of psalm preludes written between 1915 and 1916, and the first of the Opus 17, which is the Rhapsodies.
Oh yes. So yeah, he was doing pretty well with some good compositional output until in 1915 he was diagnosed with Graves' disease, which is an autoimmune disorder. It's the one where your thyroid makes too much of its substance, its thyroid, I guess, hormone, and you wind up having all these really bad symptoms. So his poor health prevented him from being conscripted in World War I, arguably preserving him from the worst fate awaiting Gurney and others of his friends and contemporaries. So he was a person who, thanks to a pretty unpleasant hyperthyroidism, was spared death, more than likely, as a result of not going to war. So at St. Thomas's Hospital, he was given the previously untried treatment of radium injections in the neck, administered twice a week over a period of 2 years. For much of this time, Howells traveled between London for treatment and Lydney, where he was nursed by his mother. He was nonetheless still able to compose, and in 1916 produced the first work of his mature composition, the first work that we can look at decisively and go, this is very, very well-written music. So the piano quartet in A minor, dedicated to The Hill at Chosen and Ivor Gurney, who knows it, was in the following year one of the first works published under the auspices of the Carnegie United Kingdom Trust. In the following year, Howells became an assistant organist at Salisbury Cathedral, but only held the post for a few months, finding repeated journeys to London for treatment too difficult. Friends then arranged for a grant from the Carnegie Trust, which paid for Howells to assist R. Terry in editing the voluminous Latin Tudor repertoire that Terry and his choir were reviving at the Westminster Cathedral. So the work provided Howells with a comfortable income, and it enabled him to absorb the English Renaissance style, which he would later evoke in his music, which he loved. His first significant works for choir, the three carol anthems, were written around this time: The Hero's Little Door, A Spotless Rose, and Sing Lullaby. I think the most famous of those three is A Spotless Rose. I think that's a huge Christmas classic. People sing that all the damn time.
Yeah. So in 1920s, Howells married Dorothy Dahl, who lived between 1891 and 1975, and she was a singer whom he had met in 1911 when he was when he was deputizing her as a accompanist. The marriage endured despite Howells' frequent infidelities and produced two children: Ursula, who lived between 1922 and 2005, who was later an actress, and Michael, who lived between 1926 and 1935, only 9 years. And this Michael, his son, is all going to play a very important part in the composition that we're going to talk about today. So
yeah, Ursula Howells. She's I imagine she probably was named after Vaughan Williams's daughter Ursula. I don't know.
Yeah. So in this same year, in 1920, he joined the staff at the Royal College of Music, where he was to remain until 1979. Among his students were Robert Simpson, Gordon Jacob, James Bernard, Paul Spicer, Madeline Dring, and Imogen Holst, who we talked about last week.
Oh yes.
So this post that he held at the RCM, which from 1925 he combined with the position of director of music at St. Paul's Girls' School, and frequent work as a competition educator, was to reduce the amount of time he could devote to composition. But he continued to write orchestral and chamber music, including the string quartet in Gloucestershire. in Gloucestershire, which was originally written in 1916, but rewritten in whole or in part several times, and not reaching its final form until the 1930s. And a quick aside here, that's kind of a theme that happens throughout his compositional life, where he starts something, but he doesn't go anywhere with it, and then later he revises it, and then he finally publishes. He does this a lot, where he has a lot of earlier kind of pieces that he finally either publishes or recomposes. So this also another composition from this time is the overture Mary I from 1920, and the second piano concerto of 1925. The first performance of this concerto occasioned a demonstration in the concert hall from a hostile critic. Howells, always oversensitive to criticism, withdrew this work and produced few significant compositions for several years. So he didn't like criticism that much, as we can see.
These things happen.
Yeah, so one exception was Lambert's clavichord of 1928, which was a rare example of a composition by a 20th century composer for that instrument. It was inspired by a clavichord lent to Howells by his friend Herbert Lambert, an instrument maker and photographer based in Bath. Several other major compositions written around this time, however, remained unperformed, notably an a cappella requiem to English words written in 1932, and a choral work named A Kent Yeoman's Wooing Song, written the following year, in 1933.
So yeah, so he had some good output there. Mm-hmm. I just Googled Ursula Howells. Turns out she's this really well-known English actress.
Oh, really?
I had no idea. 1922 to 2005. Oh. She was in all kinds of film and television. There you go. Anyway, family tragedy. So things didn't go so well for his son. This is part of our story with Hymnus Paradisi. In September 1935, Howells found out that his 9-year-old son had contracted polio, his son Michael, during a family holiday, and then he died in London only 3 days after the diagnosis. Howells was deeply affected and continued to commemorate the event until the end of his life. People have trouble mourning the death of a child. Obviously, that's a pretty big deal. Mm-hmm. So at the suggestion of his daughter Ursula, he sought to channel his grief into music, and over the next 3 years composed much of this large-scale choral work, which was eventually to become Hymnus Paradisi, drawing on material from the unpublished Requiem of 1932. This remained, in Howells' words, a personal, almost secret document, quote-unquote, until 1950. So other commemorative works written around this time include the Concerto for Strings, written in 1938, the slow movement of which is in joint memory of Michael and Edward Elgar. Michael, his son, and Edward Elgar, the composer. Mm-hmm. The hymn tune Michael, to the words All My Hope on God is Founded, by Robert Bridges. and the unfinished cello concerto, on which Howells had been working at the time, at the time of his boy's death, and which he found himself unable to complete. To a greater or lesser extent, however, much of Howells' subsequent music shows the influence of this loss. It's a really huge deal, but I'd say that the biggest work that comes out of Michael's death to polio is the Hymnus Paradisi, which we'll talk about in a bit.
Yeah. So from the late 1930s, Howells turned increasingly to choral and organ music, composing a second series of psalm preludes, followed by a set of 6 pieces who he began in 1939, of which the third, which was Master Tallis' Testament, a particular favorite of the composer's, recalled his formative experience of Van Williams' Tallis Fantasia. Also a set of 4 anthems, originally titled In Time of War, and including the popular O Pray for the Peace of Jerusalem and Like as the Heart. In August of that year, Howells was invited to serve as acting organist of St. John's College in Cambridge, replacing Robin Orr, who was away on active service in World War II. Howells' association with Cambridge, which lasted until the end of the war in 1945, was a productive and happy period for him, and led directly to the works of which he is most remembered. He later recalled being challenged by the dean of King's College, Eric Milner White, to write a set of canticles for the choir. The result.
We'll talk about canticles in a bit.
So the result was the Te Deum and Jubilate of the service known as Collegium Regali, performed in
King's College.
Performed in 1944. Followed the following year by the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis, and completed in 1956 by the Office of Holy Communion. This Collegium Regale and the evening service of Gloucester and St. Paul's Cathedral, which followed in 1946 and 1951 respectively, remain the best known and most admired of the many settings of the Anglican liturgy written by Howells for particular choirs and buildings over the next 30 years.
So canticles, so those are those songs that are always the same for prayer services in the Anglican Church, either in the morning or the evening. The evening ones are the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis, and these are pieces that are in the Anglican tradition always in English. My soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Savior is the Magnificat, and it goes on. Nunc Dimittis as a different text. But these are works that Howells wrote a heck of a lot of. He wrote about, I'd say, 25 of these pairs, of these two canticles, they're called. And so that's probably how most people who know who Herbert Howells is know him. They know him through having sung one or two of his canticle sets. So in 1949, the organist Herbert Sumsion asked Howells if he had anything that could be performed at the 1950 Three Choirs Festival, which was to be held in Gloucester. So Howells decided to bring out the incomplete choral work that he had written in his son Michael's memory between 1936 and 1938. In later years, Howells claimed it was at the urging of Vaughan Williams that the piece was disinterred, that it was taken away. So the work, retitled Hymnus Paradisi, at Sumsion's suggestion, was completed and orchestrated in time for its first performance on September 7, 1950, the day after the 15th anniversary of Michael's death. It was Howells' greatest public and critical success, and for many years was his best-known work. This very, very large work. We'll talk about it in a minute. So shorter choral works written around this time include the carol anthem Long, Long Ago in 1951, the introit Behold, O God, Our Defender, which is written for Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, and in 1953, the House of the Mind in 1954, for chorus and strings. So he wrote plenty of things other than the Hymnus Paradisi around the early 50s. Not that, I mean, he had that premiered while having done that. So he wrote the Hymnus Paradisi in the mid-30s. He had it actually premiered 1950.
Though not an Orthodox Christian, Howells was now chiefly identified with the composition of religious music. His follow-up work was the Hymnus Paradisi, was an extended setting of the Latin Mass for soloist, chorus, and orchestra, named Missa Sabrinensis, after the River Tavern, and first performed in Worcester Cathedral as part of the Three Choirs Festival in 1954. It was considered a disappointment after the success of the earlier work, and its extreme complexity and difficulty has prevented it becoming widely known. The critic Michael Kennedy, however, considers it one of Howells' finest work. Howells followed this composition with an English Mass written in 1956, which is a smaller scale setting of setting to English words for chorus, string, and organ. His final large-scale choral work was the Stabat Mater, setting a text whose subsidiary theme of a parent mourning a child had obviously personal significance. He began it in 1959, but found it difficult to complete. It was not performed until 1965. In the meantime, Howells had been commissioned to write a motet for the memorial service of John F. Kennedy, so he chose to set the Helen Waddell's translation of Prudentius Hymnus circa exequias defuncti, the first two lines of which had served as epigraph to Hymnus Paradisi. The resulting work, Take Him Earth for Cherishing, of 1963, linking the loss of Kennedy with Howells' loss of his son, is described by Howells' pupil Paul Spicer as, quote, a classic of 20th century choral music, unquote, and an undoubted masterpiece, unquote.
So Howells continued to compose well into his late 80s, but he wrote nothing further on the scale of this Stabat Mater. One of the last works to appear in his lifetime was the Requiem, edited for performance from his old manuscripts, edited in 1980 and published the following year, almost 50 years after its composition. So you can imagine there's a lot of, you can add some good mature decision-making skills of a aged composer in that Requiem, which is performed much more often than the Hymnus Paradisi these days because it takes fewer forces, obviously. So he died on February 23, 1983, in a nursing home in Putney, one day after his good friend Sir Adrian Bolt and his ashes were interred in Westminster Abbey. So he died at a sort of a ceremonious time, having died with his good friend and the person who conducted many important works of English composers, including Howells. They're both interred in Westminster Abbey at the same time.
So Howells held many other appointments, including the presidencies of the Incorporated Society of Musicians, the Plains Song and Medieval Music Society, and the Royal College of Organists. In 1931, he became the first John Collard Fellow of the Worshipful Company of Musicians, and in 1959 succeeded Elgar and Vaughan Williams as the third John Collard's Life Fellow. He was master of the company in 1959 to 1960. In 1937, he was awarded the degree of Doctor of Music at Oxford, and in 1961 he was awarded an honorary doctorate at Cambridge, where he was made an honorary fellow of St. John's College in 1966. Other honors include the CBE of 1953,
Commander of the British Empire.
Commander of the British Empire, and CH of 1972.
That stands for something.
Something else. He wrote
those are
a number
orders of knighthood, is what those are.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. And he wrote a number of articles in a rich, allusive style and delivered many radio talks as well.
So, all around good guy. So Howells' mature style skillfully interweaves a number of strands. So of his formative influences, probably the most important were modal counterpoint, which he got from his Tudor models, Elgar and his elegiac aspects, and Vaughan Williams, whose Talus Fantasia had a huge effect on the young composer, and whose Pastoral Symphony, on which Howells wrote a very large article, deeply influenced the string quartet in Gloucestershire. The most substantial of Howells' instrumental works. To these must also be added the topography of his native Gloucestershire and his love of English literature. Now, these quintessentially English ingredients are mixed with an un-English technical assurance and made piquant by richly sensuous harmonies. So his harmonies can arguably be more French in origin. He did know Ravel personally. But his early chamber works, notably the piano quartet and the fantasy string quartet, and the Rhapsodic Quintet for clarinet and strings, and In Gloucestershire. All of these reveal a sort of a natural poet in sound. He is very, very aware of structural problems and knows how to solve them. The strong melodic impulse is often vocal in feeling, so even in his instrumental works, a lot of these works have a line. And I have to say that's probably one of Howells's most... I think if I'm listening to a composer and I hear a very long, seemingly unmeasured, but actually very precisely measured sound of several different lines, that's Howells. He is a guy that writes many different lines and does it quite effectively. So here already are many of the qualities that made him the finest grained of the Georgian composers, of the composers around the time of King George. Howells, by the early 1920s, with a string of successes behind him, was a composer of whom much was expected. People sort of expected him to carry on the torch from his older friends, Vaughan Williams and Holst and those guys. So two major orchestral commissions, Sine Nomine and the second piano concerto, both in 1922 and 25 respectively, saw him grappling with the problem of single movement form, but neither work was very well received. I honestly have not heard either one. And the failure of the concerto's premiere followed by its withdrawal. It was not revived until after the composer's death in '83. So all of this brought about a creative crisis. So Howells, immersing himself in teaching and adjudicating, wound up producing few substantial works between 1925 and 35. And then in 35, when Michael dies, his son, his creativity starts to blossom more after that.
There is in all of Howells' best music an underlying, mournful sense of fleetingness and loss. He was deeply affected by the human waste of World War I, and his elegy of 1917, composed in memory of a close friend killed in the fighting, is an eloquent expression of personal grief. The death from polio of his own 9-year-old son in 1935 affected him at the deepest level, and it is arguably the most of his subsequent work were to the greater or lesser degree influenced by it. Of course, we're going to talk about that. These qualities are evident in other works, including Made Peerless for Women's Chorus, the unaccompanied Take Him, Earth for Cherishing, and The Summer Is Coming. In the music for the church to which he turned in his last years.
So Howells did have a lifelong love of cathedral architecture, speaking of church. And much of his church music was written for specific buildings and choirs and individuals. So in the sacred works, he found the perfect niche for his languid romanticism. It was just a love of choral texture and resonant acoustics. Lots of chromatic things happening. So he created an ecclesiastical style for the 20th century as Stanford had done for the 19th. Sort of a reflective, introvert, nostalgic nature of the office of evensong, found in echoes of Howells' own persona, and at the heart of his religious music stand 16 settings of the canticles, of which those for King's College, Cambridge, Gloucester, and St. Paul's Cathedral have established firm places in the repertoire. He even wrote some for Dallas, the Dallas Canticles in Texas. There are a number of large-scale anthems, including among which are the House of the Mind, which we talked about earlier, and the sequence for St. Michael in 61. Those are examples of that.
Among the best of Howells' songs are his settings of verses by De la Mare, a personal friend. They include the cycle Peacock Pie of 1919 and the collection A Garland for De la Mare written between 1919 and 1973.
That's a pretty wide span.
Yeah, crazy span there. So for the poet, King David was the perfect setting. In setting the Gregorian poets, his ingrained sense of transience of beauty saved him from the cliché style of some of his contemporaries. His distinguished body of organ music includes 4 rhapsodies, 2 sets of song preludes, and 2 sonatas. The second of 1932 being his largest and most important solo works. The late Partita, written between 1971 and 72, written in a spare, austere, almost neoclassical idiom, shares characteristics with the contemporaneous sonatina for piano. In 2 sets of miniatures, Lambert clavichords and Howells clavichord, and in Master Tallis' Testament for organ, Howells, who used flippantly to describe himself as a reincarnation of one of these lesser Tudor composers, alludes to the world of the Elizabethan virginalist, but placed in an unmistakably modern idiom.
So he was a person who was constantly taking in these old English models.
Looking back.
Oh yeah. So Howells' star rose early and seemed to wane in the late 1920s. Although the success of Hymnus Paradisi and the late outpouring of church music reestablished his reputation, to the post-war generation, he was known for little else, that is. He did not achieve the position at the pinnacle of English music that was predicted for him. However, the posthumous rediscovery of his early instrumental and orchestral music has revealed a lot of his lesser-known range and depth. So at the close of the 20th century, his importance was becoming better understood, and it continues to be pretty well understood. A lot of that is due to the efforts of his daughter Ursula, which I read a bit when I looked up earlier. Like she was pretty big on starting a Herbert Howells Society and really promoting his work. That was only after our father's death. But yeah, so he's been more and more appreciated these days. But this brings us to the work that we are here to talk about today, and that is...
Which is Hymnus Paradisi of 1938. Well, kind of. It started in 1938.
Might as well be 1930.
Yeah. So the first performance was at the Three Choirs Festival at Gloucester in 1950, which the composer conducted. The Bach Choir gave the first London performance early in 1951 and recorded the work in 1970 with the Philharmonia Orchestra under Sir David Wilcox.
Who just died about, I guess, 4 months ago now? Something like that.
Yeah. So this piece consists of 6 movements. We have the first movement, which is Preludio, only for orchestra. The second movement, Requiem Aeternam. The first 30 bars are identical to the third movement of the Requiem of 1936. The third movement is The Lord is my Shepherd, which is a setting of Psalm 23. The fourth movement, Sanctus, I will lift up mine eyes, which juxtaposes the Sanctus from the ordinary of the Mass with Psalm 121. And then movement 5 is I heard a voice from heaven from the burial service. And the last movement, Holy is the True Light, from the Salisbury Diurnal, translation by J.H. Palmer.
Yeah, so...
G.H. Palmer,
G.H. Palmer, yeah. Salisbury Diurnal. What a funny name. They don't use those words anymore, or at least diurnal. Kind of sounds like journal when you say it. I guess that's exactly what it means.
Journal, but yeah.
So 4 of the choral movements, that is 2 through 5, those are settings of Latin and English texts. These are drawn from the Psalms and from the Missa Pro Defunctis, the Book of Common Prayer, and are immemorial reflections upon the transient griefs and indestructible hopes of mankind. All are appropriate to the mood and purpose of a requiem. So movement 6 is a setting of lines from the Salisbury Diurnal, used here in the translation by Dr. G.H. Palmer, appearing at the end of Robert Bridges' anthology, The Spirit of Man.
Yeah. So there's the circumstances around this composition are hard rendering. We talked about a lot of this, right? Where his son died. Let's see.
He was 9 years old, if that wasn't very.
Yeah. So Michael was 9 years old when he died, and in an attempt to help her inconsolable father, his daughter Ursula suggested he should commemorate Michael in music. As Howell later wrote, quote, "The sudden loss of an only son might impel a composer to seek release and consolation in a language and terms most personal to him. Music might well have power to offer that release and comfort. It did so in my case," unquote.
So that's right. If you're ever having a bad time, just write a monumental work for orchestra and choir.
Choir.
Always seems to be just fine. Make sure if it's 45 minutes, it'll definitely help you.
Yeah, and work that's going to take you 20 years to perform.
Yeah, that generally helps just in general. So in 1932, Howells had composed a requiem, which we've talked about, although it remained unperformed until almost the end of his life, up in when he was in his 80s. So it was also around this time that he discovered Helen Waddell's medieval Latin lyrics, which included Prudentius's Hymnus circa exequias defuncti. If you excuse my English Latin, I've decided I like to use English Latin these days. It begins nunc sucipi terre, favendum gremioqui hunc consaipi moli. And he's just laughing. Or we can do it in classical. Nunc suscipe terra, favendum gremioque hunc concipe molli. Or in sung Latin, whatever. So, and that in her translation reads, "Take him, earth, for cherishing, to thy tender breast receive him." He set them as part of an incomplete motet, and later became the inscription at the head of the score of what was to become this piece, Hymnus Paradisi. Later still, he set the words entirely in his motet, which is commemorating President Kennedy after his assassination.
Yep. So Howells drew on some of the text and music of the earlier Requiem. In the new work, he began to write at his daughter's prompting, referring to it as the Revised Requiem. The Latin and English texts are taken from the Psalms, the Missa pro Defunctis, and the Salisbury Diurnal, which he described as, quote, "in memorial reflections upon the transient griefs and indestructible hopes of mankind," unquote. He explained that he, quote, "used only 2 sentences from the Latin Requiem Mass at the beginning and the end, knowing that one of them, et lux perpetua luceat eis, would govern the work, especially that one word, lux, which is light," unquote. Howells wished to end the work in a mood of optimism rather than tragedy. He needed to summon, quote, "an even more intense degree of the work's pervasive radiance," unquote. For some time, however, he could not find a suitable text until a friend suggested "Holy is the True Light" at the end of Robert Bridges' anthology, "The Spirit of Man." For Howells, this was the perfect solution. So trying to end with a more hopeful manner at the end of this work.
So yeah, having completed the work in short score in 1938 and achieved through its composition a personal catharsis in relation to his sorrow, it was put away as a private and personal document. Can you imagine writing this humongous work and just putting it in your desk? To be fair, it would take a lot of money to get the thing going. I see it. You know, if you're feeling particularly down and out, you might not want to put it on, but no, it's this magnificent work. So it was in 1949, Herbert Sumsion, we've talked about earlier, master of music at Gloucester Cathedral, approached Howells for a work for the 1953 Choirs Festival, which we mentioned earlier. Howells played through his revised Requiem to him. Sumsion, realizing that here was a work of immense quality, offered to perform it. It was, however, only after Gerald Finzi, Vaughan Williams, and Bolt expressed similar views that Howells agreed. Finzi, another very big mid-20th century composer of English music. He then orchestrated the work and probably composed the orchestral preludio at this time. The title was Sumsion's inspired suggestion, Hymnus Paradisi. So Howells conducted the first performance of Hymnus Paradisi on September 7, 1950. Isabel Bailey and William Herbert were the soloists. This for soprano and tenor with choir. So you have these humongous soloists. Oh.
Yeah. So this work, of course, Hymnus Paradisi, is best regarded as twofold. Part 1, which are movements 1, 2, or 3, are continuous. In general, this part is contemplative, but not wholly so. There are moments of intense feeling, even in the brief, concentrated prelude, as well as in the choral Requiem Aeterna Dona Eis, to which the prelude is linked. And the Psalm 23, the third movement, is itself touched by the brooding, darker colors of the orchestral prelude. This movement, Psalm 23, represents 3 of 4 brief themes that have place on their merry variants in all the succeeding movements except movements 5. So the themes, the musical themes that were here in this third movement will be present later throughout the piece.
Yeah, this is a darn good work. I mean, I would put it up pretty much right at the Brahms German Requiem in terms of its sophistication and really carefully designed harmonies. And lines that create these harmonies. So throughout, Howells' command of choral and orchestral polyphony is masterly. And in the description of the music that follows, extracts from the composer's own program notes are quoted. In the brief, concentrated preludio, two important themes are heard at the outset, somber and grief-laden. There is a dramatic eruption of anguish in the middle, leading to a climax that bursts like a shaft of consoling light. Always with shafts of light, describing music these days. Despite its contemplative nature, the Requiem Aeternam that follows has moments of intense feeling, quote-unquote, as when the words at the crux of the whole work, et lux perpetua, are introduced. With the soprano soloist's entry, the tempo quickens and her tender, soaring melody is set to limpid, delicate orchestration. Just really carefully and tightly designed music.
Yeah, and when I was listening to this, I heard definitely heard a lot of Vaughan Williams in this work, especially, we talked about Vaughan Williams 5 in this podcast before, and I heard a lot of correlations there between the two works. But definitely this is a great work. So the setting of The Lord is My Shepherd is touched by the brooding, darker colors of the preludio. In tranquil phrases, the soprano and tenor soloists sing of the waters of comfort, before the chorus, in nervous, intense music, reflects the fear of the valley of the shadow of death. A fervent climax is reached at I will dwell in the house of the Lord, before the tenor and chorus conclude the setting with a typical Howellsian aching, melting cadence on the word nothing.
If you want some good Howellsian aching, melting cadences, they abound. You find them everywhere. The end of A Spotless Rose has one of those really well-known. Some people, I think Wilcox or somebody like that, claimed that cadence was the most beautiful ending of any piece. Just this nice little choral piece, carol that ends with this lovely progression. So part 2, which is movements 4, 5, and 6, comprises 3 separate sections. These, especially 4 and 6, mark a new level in the work, one that is more dynamic, higher charged, further ranging. The rhythmic drive of the middle phases of I will lift up mine eyes, and the gradual subjugation of Psalm 121 by the Sanctus in 4, at the first major climax of the hymnus, are the chief factors in the changed mood of the work. So you feel quite a different pace when you get to this movement. This simultaneous setting of a double text, one in English, the other in Latin, so kind of macaronic, is a point of departure at which the work turns for a time away from its initial brooding contemplation and takes on an almost defiant activity. Similar to Brahms's Requiem, Tod, wo ist dein Stachel? Where is your sting, Death? Where is your victory? Sort of like that. So there is some relation there. So in movement 4, which is a union of Psalm and Sanctus, there is a constantly increasing heightening of color. The semi-chorus, the 2 soloists, and the main chorus all move toward a climax in which the Sanctus, for a time, supersedes the Psalm. It's so loud you can't really even make sense of the psalm. So, and the long quiet stretches in which the psalm is again taken up and completed do not essentially diminish the new luminous quality of the choral and orchestral texture. There is a lot going on in that movement.
Yeah. In the Sanctus, Howells set a combination of Psalm 121 in English and the Latin Sanctus to music that simply blazes with light. The opening seems to evoke the heavenly host, and a climax is reached on the word Sanctus, with the soloist riding high above the chorus in an ecstatic song of praise. Almost immediately afterward, the first major climax of the work occurs, and with it a point of departure at which the work turns away from the initial brooding contemplation and takes on an almost defiant activity. After a further heady climax at Pleni Suncelli, the tempo slackens, bringing music of consolation. After this energy, I heard the voice is a contemporary easing of tension. Its restraint and quiet give it the character of an interlude. There is a temporary easing of tension and elimination of complexities. Placed between 2 big movements, 4 and 6, its restraint and quiet give it the character of an interlude. In the scheme of the work, it is, in function, a tranquil preparation for the final section that follows, the final movement.
So on to the final section. The final movement, Holy is the True Light, unfolds in the three great surges of luminous choral and orchestral writing. Over a deep pedal point, distant ethereal trumpets are heard above an ever-swirling orchestral texture until the chorus enters. The tension rises until a sonorous climax and an exultant change of key. As the material regenerates with each succeeding appearance, Howells carefully introduces the next part of the text, to which he added a series of alleluias. These, he said, finally prepare and launch the climax of the unfailing splendor wherein they rejoiced with gladness evermore, as the music becomes transfigured with pervasive light and warmth of consolation. That's when I'm quoting, is when I switch accents there. So with the return of immemorial Requiem Aeternam, the music turns reflective and tranquil, bringing to a close this deeply moving work in which the human tragedy of a boy's death and a father's grief are enshrined. They're sort of kept in this work. A nice little package. So this movement is a gradual oncoming of the true light and radiance that will issue in the unfailing splendor of those who have, quote, endured in the heat of the conflict, unquote. It is as if personal grief, itself spent, is merged and lost in a general pervasive light and warmth of consolation. To the translated text from the Salisbury Diurnal, the composer has added this series of alleluias. These finally prepare and launch the climax of the, quote, unfailing splendor wherein they rejoice with gladness evermore, unquote. Thereafter, a return to the immemorial Requiem Aeternam, Requiem Dona Ius Sempiternum, is both retrospect and ending in terms of complete tranquility. So this is a huge, huge work. And really fun to do. If you ever have the forces, go ahead and do it. In fact, we, with the LSU a cappella choir, alongside some singers from High Point University in North Carolina and Ole Miss singers and other choirs, are getting together in Chattanooga this year to perform the work, which is why it's fresh on my mind.
Really?
It's tough. I'm working the piece.
You're performing this?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
It's fun. It's a whole 8 pages of bass part.
Because I told you I was going to this concert. Since I live like an hour and a half away, I'm gonna go to the concert. But I didn't know you were doing this work. That's awesome.
Oh yeah, it'll be big. And if any of those who are listening or watching care to go, we'd love to have you there at the performance there in Chattanooga. It's of the American Choral Directors Association.
I see the
meeting.
Right. Mm-hmm.
It'll be a big thing, big to do, and lots of just good gut wrenching music and just very delightfully difficult music to sing. It's tough stuff to count. Tough to find the new harmonies. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
Awesome. You have anything else on this work or on Howells?
I think I'm good for now.
All right, great. Well, we've experienced a new thing, especially for me. I mean, I've never heard Howells, that much. So it was great listening to this piece as I was preparing for this podcast. All right. Thank you for listening to another episode, of course. You can, of course, find us on iTunes or YouTube, where you can see all the annotations and all the images that we put on there. You can email us at symphonicpodcast@gmail.com if you want to tell us anything. And all right, till next time, thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening.